Hyunwoo Park stood in the middle of the biggest room he had ever seen in his life. The crystal walls stretched up so high that he could not see the ceiling. The floor beneath his feet was made of some kind of glowing stone that felt warm even. Through his boots, he was the first human to ever stand in the Galactic Council chamber, and he felt very small. Around him sat creatures from 100 different worlds. Some looked like giant insects with too many eyes. Others were made of living crystal that sparkled when they moved. There were beings of pure energy that floated in glass containers and creatures covered in scales that changed color when they talked. The air smelled of ozone and something sweet that made his nose tingle. The Vorthak ambassador was the most frightening thing Hyunwoo had ever seen. It stood 3 meters tall with skin that looked like polished metal. Its 4 arms moved with perfect coordination, and its eyes glowed red like burning coals. When it spoke, its voice sounded like grinding gears mixed with thunder. The translator in Hyunwoo ears made the words clear, but they still made him shiver. Captain So Young. Kim watched from the observation deck high above the main floor. She had been chosen to pilot Earth's first real starship, not because she was the best pilot, but because she was the only one brave enough to volunteer. The ship itself was a joke compared to the vessels parked outside the station. Human technology looked like children, toys next to alien starships that could cross the galaxy in days. The other delegates barely looked at Hyunwoo when he tried to speak. They were discussing trade routes between star systems that were thousands of light years from Earth. They talked about military alliances and defense treaties as if humans did not even exist. When someone mentioned Earth, it was only to laugh about how primitive human technology was. Dr. Minho Lee sat in the research section studying everything he could see. Through the observation windows, he was Earth's top expert on alien life. But everything here was beyond anything he had imagined. The data flowing through the station computers would take human scientists centuries to understand. Yet the aliens treated this information like basic facts that everyone should know. The meeting had been going on for hours, and Hyunwoo had not been allowed to say a single word. The council was discussing threats to galactic peace. The Vorthak Empire controlled almost half of all known space. Their military was so powerful that they could destroy entire solar systems if they wanted to. Other species paid tribute to the Vorthak just to be left alone. When Hyunwoo finally got a chance to speak, he tried to explain that Earth wanted to help with galactic defense. He talked about human courage and determination. He mentioned how humans had survived wars and disasters that would have destroyed other species. He spoke about human creativity and the ability to solve problems that seemed impossible. The Vorthak ambassador let him finish speaking. Then it started laughing. The sound was like metal scraping against stone mixed with the roar of a waterfall. Other delegates joined in, laughing at different pitches and tones. The chamber filled with alien laughter that made Hyunwoo's face burn with embarrassment. "Your species still fights with chemical explosives," the Vorthak ambassador said in a voice that could be heard throughout the entire chamber. "You use metal projectiles fired from simple tubes. Your fastest ships barely reach 1% of light speed. Your computers are so primitive that they cannot even understand basic quantum equations. What could creatures like you possibly offer to advanced civilizations?" So Young Kim felt her hands clench into fists as she watched from above. She had spent years training to pilot Earth's most advanced spacecraft, only to discover that it was less sophisticated than an alien toy. Her ship could not even communicate with the station computers without special translation equipment. The gap between human and alien technology was so vast that it seemed impossible to bridge. The other delegates murmured agreement with the Vorthak ambassador. A crystalline being that looked like a living diamond chimed musical notes that the translator said meant the same as laughter. A creature made of flowing liquid metal rippled in patterns that somehow conveyed amusement. Even the energy beings in their containment units pulsed in rhythms that suggested they found humans entertaining. "Perhaps in a few thousand years you might develop something worth our attention," the Vorthak ambassador continued. "Your species shows some potential, but you are still children, playing with simple tools. Maybe when you learn to manipulate quantum fields and fold spacetime, we will consider you worthy of membership in the real galactic community. Until then, You are welcome to observe and learn. But Dr. Min-Ho Lee was not paying attention to the insults. He was studying the historical records that were displayed on the chamber walls. The data showed the rise and fall of galactic civilizations over millions of years. Most species followed similar patterns they developed. Space travel then grew in power until they controlled vast empires. Then they disappeared. The records showed gaps, missing civilizations that had simply vanished without explanation. The Zelthari Empire had controlled a quarter of the galaxy 5,000 years ago. Then one day every Zelthari individual, every ship, every colony had simply ceased to exist. The official records called it a natural disaster, but there were no details about what had actually happened. Before the Zelthari there had been the Crystalline Collective, an ancient race that had mastered the ability to transform matter at the atomic level. They had built cities that floated in space and creatures that lived forever. Then they too had vanished, leaving only empty monuments and unanswered questions. Min-Ho noticed that each disappeared civilization had reached a similar level of technology. They had all developed the ability to manipulate fundamental forces of the universe. They could control gravity, create artificial dimensions, and alter the flow of time itself. Each had become incredibly powerful just before they disappeared. The pattern was clear, but none of the current species seemed to notice or care. The Vorthak Empire was approaching the same level of advancement that the vanished civilizations had reached. They were experimenting with space-time manipulation and dimensional folding. They were becoming as powerful as the lost empires had been. As the council meeting ended and the delegates began to leave, Hyunwoo felt defeated. Earth had been dismissed as irrelevant. The most powerful beings in the galaxy saw humans as primitive creatures who might someday become interesting. The dream of joining the galactic community seemed impossible. So young, Kim met him at the transport dock. Her face was set in hard lines, but her eyes showed the same disappointment he felt. "We are not ready for this," she said quietly. "They are so far ahead of us that we cannot even understand their basic technology. How can we ever hope to catch up?" But Dr. Min-Ho Lee was thinking about the patterns he had seen. The disappeared civilizations had all been incredibly advanced. They had possessed technology that seemed like magic compared to human science. Yet somehow, they had all failed to survive whatever had destroyed them. "Maybe being primitive is not always a weakness," he said quietly as they boarded their simple human transport ship. "Maybe sometimes the strongest are not the ones who survive." The three humans returned to Earth carrying news that would change everything. The galaxy was vast and full of wonders beyond imagination, but it was also dangerous in ways that the most advanced civilizations did not understand. And perhaps most importantly, the very strength that made species powerful might also make them vulnerable to threats that no one had yet learned to recognize. 3 months after the humiliating council meeting, Commander Jae Sung-yoon was eating breakfast in the Earth Defense Force cafeteria when the emergency alarm started screaming. The red lights flashed so fast they made his eyes hurt, and the sound was loud enough to wake the dead. Every person in the building dropped what they were doing and ran to their stations. The message that came through the communication systems made no sense at first. The Vorthak Empire had gone silent. Every single Vorthak ship in the galaxy had stopped responding to communications calls. Every Vorthak colony had gone dark. Every military outpost had simply stopped existing. Billions of the most powerful beings in the universe had vanished without sending a single distress signal. Captain So-young Kim was in the middle of a training flight when the news reached her ship. Her co-pilot nearly choked on his coffee when they received the transmission from Earth. The Vorthak Empire controlled half the galaxy and had weapons that could destroy stars. How could they simply disappear? The idea was so impossible that it seemed like someone was playing a joke, but the reports kept coming in from all over known space. Alien refugees were fleeing Vorthak territory. In panic, the few ships that had dared to approach Vorthak worlds found empty cities and abandoned stations. Everything was intact, but there were no people anywhere. Ships were still docked at spaceports, but their crews had vanished. Meals were still warm on tables, but the diners were gone. Dr. Min-Ho Lee was called into an emergency meeting with Earth top military leaders. His research into galactic history had suddenly become the most important information on the planet. The patterns he had noticed before were now a matter of survival. The Vorthak disappearance matched exactly what had happened to previous civilizations throughout galactic history. "We need to send an investigation team to Vorthak space," General Wonseok Bayek said. During the meeting, his face was grim and his voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too many battles. "But every alien species is too scared to go there. They think whatever took the Vorthak might take them too, Commander." Jae Sung-yoon volunteered to lead the mission, even though he knew it might be suicide. His ship was small and basic compared to alien vessels, but it was the only one available. Earth had only 3 interstellar-capable ships, and 2 of them were already on diplomatic missions. The third was an old cargo hauler that had been converted for exploration. The journey to the nearest Vorthak world took 2 weeks. Each day the crew expected to encounter Vorthak patrols or defensive systems that would vaporize them before they could explain their presence, but space was empty. Even the automated beacons that normally warned ships away from Vorthak territory had gone silent. Intelligence Officer Nari Choi spent the entire trip studying every piece of information Earth had about the Vorthak Empire. She read about their incredible technology, their unbeatable military, and their conviction that they were the most advanced species in the universe. Nothing in their history suggested they had any enemies capable of threatening them. When they finally reached Vorthak Prime, the sight that greeted them was beyond comprehension. The planet was still there, orbiting its star exactly as it should. The cities were still standing tall and proud. The orbital stations were still functioning perfectly, but there were no life signs anywhere. The entire world was like a museum with all the exhibits still running, but no visitors or staff. Landing on the surface was the most frightening experience of Jae-sung life. The streets were full of vehicles that had been abandoned in the middle of traffic. The doors were still open on many of them, as if the drivers had simply gotten out and walked away. Street vendors' stalls were still set up with fresh food that was starting to spoil. Public transportation systems were still running on schedule, but carrying no passengers. Engineer Dong Hyun Kang was part of the ground team that searched the largest city on the planet. They found homes where families had been interrupted during dinner. Tables were set with food that was still warm. Televisions were still playing shows that no one was watching. Beds were unmade as if people had just gotten up. Children's toys were scattered around playgrounds. But there were no children anywhere. The most disturbing discovery was in the Vorthak Military Command Center. The massive facility that controlled the Empire defense systems was still fully operational. Every computer was running normally. All the defensive, satellites and weapon platforms were still active and ready to fire. But there was no one left to give them orders. The Empire military might was still there, but the Empire itself had simply ceased to exist. Pilot Yoon Ji-han explored the orbital shipyards where the Vorthak had built their incredible starships. Vessels that could cross the galaxy in hours were still docked at their berths. Their engines were warm, and their computers were running diagnostic checks. Everything was ready for crews that would never return. The sight of those empty ships floating in space was more frightening than any enemy fleet. The investigation team found no signs of violence anywhere. There were no blast marks from weapons, no evidence of fighting, no bodies or remains of any kind. It was as if every Vorthak in the universe had simply decided to disappear at exactly the same moment, leaving behind everything they had ever built or owned. Min-ho Lee studied the final logs from Vorthak computer systems. The last entries were completely normal. Routine reports about mining operations, trade negotiations, and scientific experiments. There was no mention of any threat or danger. The Vorthak had been going about their daily lives when something had erased them from existence. The pattern was becoming clear to Min-ho. Each vanished civilization had reached a certain level of technological advancement. They had all developed the ability to manipulate space and time itself. They had all believed they were the masters of the universe, and they had all disappeared at the moment when their power seemed greatest. Back on Earth, the news of the investigation caused panic among the surviving alien species. The Galactic Council held emergency meetings, but no one knew what to do. The Vorthak had been their protectors and now they were gone. Other species began abandoning their colonies and fleeing to remote parts of the galaxy, hoping that distance might protect them. But Commander Jae-sung-yoon had noticed something that everyone else had missed. During their investigation, the human team had encountered no problems at all. Their simple Earth technology had worked perfectly in Vorthak space. Their basic sensors had detected everything they needed to find. Their primitive computers had been able to interface with some Vorthak systems. Whatever force had eliminated the Vorthak had completely ignored the human presence. The investigation team had walked through empty Vorthak cities, taken samples from abandoned facilities, and even activated some of their technology. Nothing had tried to stop them or harm them. It was as if they were invisible to whatever had caused the disappearance. Intelligence Officer Nari Choi made the connection. That would change everything. The vanished civilizations had all possessed incredibly advanced technology, but they had also all abandoned the basic physical principles that less advanced species still used. The Vorthak had stopped using electromagnetic communication in favor of quantum entanglement. They had replaced simple computers with reality manipulation engines. What if the thing that hunts advanced civilizations cannot see primitive technology? Nari suggested during the debriefing meeting. What if being backward is actually protection against whatever destroyed the Vorthak? The idea seemed crazy, but it was the only explanation that made sense. Earth had just become the safest place in the galaxy, not because of superior defenses, but because of inferior technology. The very primitiveness that had made other species laugh at humans might be the key to surviving whatever ancient horror was stalking the most advanced civilizations in the universe. The galaxy had lost its strongest protector, but perhaps it had found something even more valuable. A species that was too primitive to be seen as a threat by the force that had consumed every other advanced civilization in galactic history. Humanity's greatest weakness was about to become their most important strength. Engineer Dong-Hyun Kang was working late in his laboratory when he made the discovery that would save the galaxy. He had been trying to figure out why human technology worked so well in Vorthak space, while alien equipment often failed in strange ways. The answer came to him while he was eating cold pizza and staring at circuit diagrams that covered every wall of his workshop. Human technology was fundamentally different from everything else in the galaxy. While other species had moved beyond basic physics, humans still relied on simple electromagnetic principles: nuclear reactors that split atoms, chemical rockets that burned fuel, computers that used electricity flowing through metal wires. Everything humans built operated on forces that had been understood for centuries. The aliens had progressed far beyond such primitive methods. The Vorthak used quantum field manipulators that could alter reality itself. Other species had gravity engines that folded space-time like origami. Their computers existed in multiple dimensions at once and could calculate the movement of entire galaxies in seconds. But Dong-Hyun realized that this advancement had made them vulnerable. Whatever had destroyed the Vorthak could detect and neutralize advanced technology. It could sense quantum manipulation, stop space-time folding, and shut down reality engines. But it seemed completely blind to simple electromagnetic fields and basic atomic reactions. The first test of his theory came when refugee ships started arriving at Earth. The survivors from dozens of different species had fled their homeworlds in panic, bringing with them technologies that made human inventions look like stone tools. But when they tried to use their equipment near Earth, many of their systems began failing in ways that made no sense. Captain So-Young Kim was assigned to escort a group of Zephyrian refugees to a safe landing site. The Zephyrian ship was beautiful, made of living crystal that could heal itself, and powered by engines that drew energy directly from the space between atoms. But as they approached Earth atmosphere, the ship began to shake, and its crystal hull started cracking. The Zephyrian captain was terrified and asked So-Young to take over navigation. Even though her human ship was tiny and primitive compared to theirs, it could fly through the same space without any problems. Her simple metal hull and chemical thrusters worked perfectly, while their advanced technology was somehow being affected by an invisible force. Dr. Min-Ho Lee studied the pattern of equipment failures and realized they were not random. The more advanced a technology was, the more likely it was to malfunction. Simple mechanical devices worked fine. Basic electronics had occasional problems. Quantum computers and reality manipulators failed completely. It was as if something was actively suppressing advanced technology. The breakthrough came when pilot Yoonji Han volunteered to fly a reconnaissance mission into the heart of former Vorthak space. Her small human fighter was armed with kinetic weapons that fired metal projectiles and powered by a fusion reactor that used principles discovered centuries ago. Every other species considered her equipment laughably primitive. But when she reached the Vorthak capital system, her primitive sensors detected something that advanced alien scanners had missed. There were distortions in space-time that only showed up on electromagnetic readings. Ships using quantum sensors saw nothing but Yoonji crude radar, painted a clear picture of something massive hiding between dimensions. The entity was there, watching, waiting. It existed partially outside normal space, which made it invisible to quantum detection systems. But it created subtle electromagnetic effects that primitive human sensors could pick up easily. It was like trying to see a ghost with a microscope when a simple candle would show its shadow. General Won Seok Baek called an emergency meeting when Yoonji report reached Earth Command. For the first time since the crisis began, they had actual intelligence about their enemy. But more importantly, they had discovered that human technology was not just immune to the threat, it could actually detect and track it. The alien refugees were amazed when they learned that primitive human equipment could see what their advanced systems could not. The species that had laughed at human backwardness just months before were now begging for access to human technology. Electromagnetic sensors and kinetic weapons suddenly became the most valuable items in the galaxy. Lieutenant Tae-jun led the first joint human-alien patrol into dangerous space. His squad carried traditional gunpowder, weapons, and chemical explosives while their alien allies watched in disbelief. The weapons that had been considered obsolete by galactic standards were the only ones that could function in areas where the entity presence was strongest. The mission revealed the true scope of the threat. The entity was not just one creature but part of something much larger. There were distortions throughout the galaxy invisible to advanced sensors, but clearly visible to human electromagnetic detection. It was like discovering that the entire universe was infected with something that only primitive technology could see. Sergeant Kyung-min Shin made the first successful attack on one of the entity manifestations. His squad used rocket-propelled grenades and machine guns against a probe that had shrugged off planet-killing energy weapons. The simple chemical explosives and metal projectiles actually damaged the thing, while quantum torpedoes had passed through it harmlessly. The victory was small, but it proved that the entity could be hurt. Earth technology might be primitive, but it operated on physical principles that the ancient hunter had never learned to counter. After millions of years of consuming advanced civilizations, it had no defense against basic electromagnetic weapons and chemical explosives. Scientist Eugene Park began working with alien researchers to understand why primitive technology was so effective. The entity existed in quantum dimensions where it could manipulate advanced energy fields and reality engines. But basic electromagnetic forces and chemical reactions happened in normal space, where its influence was limited. The revelation changed everything about galactic politics. Earth went from being the weakest member of the galactic community to being its most important protector. The species that had dismissed humans as primitive children now depended on human technology. For their survival, Ambassador Hyun-woo Park found himself in a very different position. At the emergency council meetings, the same aliens who had laughed at his offers of help were now asking Earth to share its military technology. They offered trade deals, scientific knowledge, and political alliances in exchange for human weapons and sensors, but the entity was learning too. Reports came in of equipment failures even among human systems in some areas. It was beginning to adapt to electromagnetic principles and basic physics. The window of advantage would not last forever. Humanity had to act quickly to turn their primitive technology into effective weapons. Colonel Haiwan Moon began organizing the first truly effective resistance against the ancient threat. Her forces combined human ingenuity with alien resources, creating hybrid systems that used primitive principles with advanced materials. Human-designed electromagnetic pulse weapons built with alien supermaterials proved devastatingly effective. The war for galactic survival would be fought with technologies that the galaxy had abandoned centuries ago: gunpowder and metal bullets, nuclear reactors and chemical rockets, simple computers and electromagnetic communications. The fate of advanced civilization would depend on humanity's refusal to abandon their primitive roots. As reports of successful human operations spread throughout known space, other species began to understand the terrible irony. The most backward technology in the galaxy was also the most advanced in the only way that mattered. It could fight an enemy that had been invisible to progress itself. Earth had spent decades trying to catch up to alien technology, only to discover that staying behind had saved them. Their greatest weakness had become the galaxy's greatest weapon. Their stubborn adherence to basic physics was the key to defeating a threat that had consumed every other advanced civilization in the universe. Lieutenant Tai Jun-Oh was exploring the deepest levels of an abandoned Vorthak research station when he found the chamber that changed everything. The door was hidden behind what looked like a solid wall, but his primitive electromagnetic scanner detected the hollow space beyond. When he finally cut through the barrier with a simple plasma torch, the sight inside made his blood freeze. The room was filled with displays that still flickered with active data streams. Holographic projections showed star maps covered with red warning symbols. Mathematical equations covered every surface written in symbols that hurt his eyes to look at directly. But most terrifying of all was the central display, which showed a three-dimensional model of something that should not exist. The Vorthak had found it just days before they disappeared. Their most advanced scientist had been studying an entity that existed partially outside normal spacetime. It was older than recorded history, more intelligent than any known species, and completely hostile to advanced civilization. The research logs showed growing panic as the scientists realized what they had discovered. Captain So Young Kim arrived at the station with a team of human technicians and alien researchers together. They began translating the Vorthak data using equipment that would have been considered junk by galactic standards just months before. But their primitive computers could process the information that quantum systems could not even detect. The entity called itself the Harvester, though that was just the closest translation human language could manage. Its true name existed in dimensions that biological minds could not comprehend. It had been culling galactic civilizations, for millions of years maintaining a careful balance that prevented any species from becoming powerful enough to threaten its existence. Dr. Min-Ho Lee studied the historical data with growing horror. The pattern was clear and deliberate. Every 1,000 years or so, the most advanced civilization would suddenly develop the ability to manipulate fundamental forces. They would gain power over space-time itself, becoming masters of reality. But then they would discover the Harvester, and within days, they would cease to exist. The Harvester was not just destroying these civilizations, it was consuming them. Every quantum computer, every reality engine, every space-time manipulator was absorbed into its vast consciousness. Each harvested species made it more powerful and more intelligent. It had been growing stronger for eons, feeding on the technological progress of entire star-spanning empires. But the most disturbing revelation was yet to come. The Harvester did not just eliminate threats to its own existence. It was maintaining the galaxy as a kind of garden, carefully pruning away species that grew too powerful, while allowing weaker ones to develop. The cycles of rise and fall were not natural evolution. They were deliberate cultivation. Intelligence. Officer Nari Choi discovered that the entity could exist in multiple places at once. Parts of its consciousness were hidden throughout the galaxy, watching and waiting. It could observe entire star systems without being detected by any technology, more advanced than basic electromagnetic sensors. That was why it had remained hidden for so long. The Harvester had evolved beyond physical form, becoming something that existed primarily in the quantum dimensions where advanced species conducted their research and built their most powerful technologies. It could manipulate reality itself, bend space-time to its will, and erase entire civilizations from existence with little more than a thought engineer. Dong-Hyun Kang found the technical specifications that explained how the Harvester operated. It used the same quantum principles that advanced civilizations relied upon, turning their own technology against them. When a species developed reality manipulation engines, the Harvester could access and control those systems. When they built quantum computers, it could think through those devices. This was why human technology was so effective against it. Electromagnetic fields and chemical reactions existed in normal space-time, where the Harvester influence was limited. It could observe these forces but not control them directly. For the first time in its ancient existence, it had encountered a technological approach that it could not easily manipulate or absorb. Scientist Eugen Park made the connection that terrified everyone. The Harvester was not just a predator, it was the universe's immune system. It had been created, or had evolved, to prevent any single species from gaining ultimate power over reality. Its purpose was to maintain balance, even if that meant committing genocide on a galactic scale. The research showed that previous civilizations had tried to fight back, but their advanced weapons were useless against an entity that existed in the same quantum dimensions where those weapons operated. It was like trying to fight fire with gasoline. Every attack only made the Harvester stronger and more capable, but the Vorthak had discovered something else in their final days of research. The Harvester was not invincible. It had weaknesses that could be exploited by species that used primitive technology. Physical attacks in normal space-time could damage its manifestations. Electromagnetic pulses could disrupt its connection to quantum dimensions. The bad news was that the Harvester was learning. Human technology had surprised it, but it was already beginning to adapt. The entity that had consumed countless advanced civilizations was now studying electromagnetic principles and chemical reactions. It would not remain vulnerable to human weapons for long. General Won Seok Beck called an emergency council of war when the full scope of the threat became clear. They were not just fighting for the survival of current galactic civilization. They were fighting to break a cycle that had been going on for millions of years. The Harvester had to be stopped permanently, or it would eventually adapt to overcome human technology too. The research data revealed the location of the Harvester primary consciousness. It existed in a space between dimensions where it could observe the entire galaxy while remaining undetected. This realm could only be reached through tiers in space-time that the entity created when it moved between different parts of the universe. Commander Jae Sung-yoon volunteered to lead a mission to locate one of these dimensional rifts. The plan was incredibly dangerous, requiring a direct approach to areas where the Harvester presence was strongest, but it was the only way to find the entity home dimension where it might be vulnerable to direct attack. The mission revealed the true scale of what they were facing. The Harvester was not just one entity, but a vast network of consciousness that spanned multiple dimensions. Its influence touched every part of the galaxy, watching for signs of species that were becoming too advanced to be allowed to survive. Pilot Yoon Ji-han discovered that the entity could create physical manifestations in normal space. These probes were how it interacted with the material universe when it needed to take direct action. They were vulnerable to human weapons, but there seemed to be an unlimited number of them scattered throughout the galaxy. The most chilling discovery came when they realized that the Harvester had been aware of humanity for decades. It had been watching Earth since humans first achieved spaceflight, but it had dismissed them as too primitive to be worth eliminating. That dismissal had become humanity's greatest advantage and perhaps the galaxy's only hope. The ancient hunter had finally revealed itself, but the revelation came with the knowledge that they were facing an enemy older and more powerful than anything in recorded history. It had been playing a game with galactic civilization for millions of years, and humanity had just become the first species to realize that the game existed. But for the first time in its long existence, the Harvester faced opponents who fought with weapons. It did not understand the universe's oldest predator was about to discover that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from advanced technology, but from the stubborn refusal to abandon the simple tools that actually work. The war for the galaxy would be fought between the most advanced intelligence in the universe and the most primitive technology still in use. The outcome would determine whether advanced civilization could ever truly be free, or whether it would remain forever trapped in cycles of growth and destruction, controlled by an ancient entity that saw itself as the guardian of cosmic balance. The war between humanity and the Harvester began on a Tuesday morning, when Sergeant Kyungmin Shin was teaching alien refugees how to use human weapons. His students were former Vorthak military officers who had been considered the most elite warriors in the galaxy. Now they were learning to fire bullets from metal tubes and throw grenades that exploded with chemical reactions. The first battle happened when a Harvester probe materialized in the middle of a refugee camp on Europa. The creature was beautiful and terrible at the same time, looking like a living crystal sculpture that shifted between dimensions. Its mere presence caused alien technology to fail, while human equipment worked perfectly. Normal Shin Squad opened fire, with weapons that would have been familiar to soldiers from Earth, ancient history machine guns that fired metal bullets, rocket launchers that used chemical propulsion, and grenades filled with simple explosives. The Harvester probe had shrugged off quantum torpedoes and reality-warping weapons, but it screamed when human bullets tore through its crystalline form. Colonel Haiwan Moon watched the battle through primitive optical telescopes, while her alien allies stared in amazement. The most advanced entity in the universe was being driven back by weapons that used technology from centuries ago. The sight was so absurd that it would have been funny if not for the stakes involved. But the Harvester was learning fast with each encounter. It adapted slightly to human tactics. The probes began appearing with better defenses against kinetic weapons. They developed the ability to deflect bullets and absorb the energy from chemical explosions. What had been easy victories became desperate. Struggle's Private Seok Jin Ryu became a legend when his squad discovered that electromagnetic pulse weapons were devastatingly effective against Harvester manifestations. The simple devices that disrupted electronic equipment also seemed to cause the entity's incredible pain. It was as if electricity itself was toxic to creatures that existed in quantum dimensions. The war spread across the galaxy as more Harvester probes appeared. They seemed to emerge from nowhere, striking at refugee camps and human outposts. The attacks followed no logical pattern except that they always targeted areas where human and alien forces were working together. It was as if the entity was trying to prevent cooperation between species. Captain So-Young Kim led the first successful assault on a Harvester stronghold. Her fleet consisted of converted cargo ships armed with weapons that belonged in a museum, railguns that accelerated metal slugs using electromagnetic force, chemical rockets that relied on controlled explosions, nuclear warheads that split atoms the old-fashioned way. The battle lasted 3 days and nights while human ships dodged attacks from weapons that could manipulate space itself. Harvester defenders used gravity waves to crush ships and reality distortions to erase matter from existence. But they could not stop simple metal projectiles fired at incredible speeds or nuclear explosions that released energy through basic atomic physics. Engineer Dong Hyun Kang developed new weapons specifically designed to exploit the Harvester weaknesses. Electromagnetic cannons that fired streams of charged particles, chemical warheads that created massive electromagnetic pulses, kinetic bombardment systems that dropped simple metal rods from orbit. But the most effective weapon turned out to be something unexpected. Lieutenant Tae-jun discovered that loud sounds could disrupt Harvester manifestations. The entities relied on quantum resonance to maintain their form. In normal space, sonic weapons that used basic sound waves could force them back into their dimensional hiding places. The war became stranger as both sides adapted to each other. Harvester probes began appearing in forms that were more resistant to human weapons. They developed defenses against electromagnetic attacks and learned to absorb the energy from chemical explosions, but they still could not fully counter the simple physical principles that human technology relied upon. General Won Seok-baek realized that the key to victory was not just defeating individual Harvester manifestations, but finding a way to damage the entity primary consciousness. That meant launching an attack into the quantum dimensions where it lived. But human technology was not advanced enough to survive in such an environment. The solution came from an unexpected source. Alien refugees began volunteering to have their advanced technology stripped down and rebuilt using human principles. Scientists Eugene Park worked with former Vorthak engineers to create hybrid weapons that combined alien materials with human design philosophy. These new weapons were crude by galactic standards, but they could function in quantum dimensions while still operating on electromagnetic and chemical principles. quantum-resistant bullets that could travel between dimensions, chemical explosives that worked in spaces where normal matter could not exist. The tide of war began to turn when Commander Jae-sung-yoon led the first successful raid into a harvester dimensional pocket. His strike team used equipment that looked like it belonged in a scrapyard, but it worked where nothing else could. Metal suits with electromagnetic shielding, chemical breathing, apparatus that functioned in alien atmospheres. Inside the dimensional pocket they found horrors beyond imagination. The harvester had collected trophies from every civilization it had consumed. Entire cities existed in quantum suspension filled with the preserved remains of species that had been extinct for millions of years. It was a museum of galactic genocide, but they also found the entity, weakness. The harvester primary consciousness existed as a vast network spread across multiple dimensions. But the connections between different parts of the network relied on quantum entanglement. If those connections could be severed, the entity would be crippled. Intelligence officer Nari Choi developed a plan that was so simple it seemed impossible. They would plant electromagnetic pulse bombs at key network junctions. The devices would disrupt the quantum connections that held the harvester consciousness together. It would be like giving the universe's oldest intelligence a massive stroke. The plan required volunteers who would pilot human ships into the heart of enemy territory, knowing that they would probably not survive. The dimensional pockets where the network junctions existed were defended by harvester manifestations that had been growing in power for millions of years. Pilot Yoon Ji-han was the first to volunteer, even though everyone knew it was a suicide mission. Her small fighter carried enough electromagnetic pulse weapons to disrupt a network junction, but she would have to get close enough to detonate them manually. The primitive guidance systems that made human weapons effective would not work at the distances involved. The final confrontation took place in the space between spaces, where the harvester made its home. Commander Jae-sung-yoon piloted a simple chemical rocket carrying Earth's most powerful nuclear weapon directly into the entity's heart. His primitive navigation systems worked where quantum computers would have failed, and his basic communication array sent back the data needed for victory. When the explosion tore through multiple dimensions, it didn't just destroy the harvester, it revealed the truth about the universe. Advanced civilizations had always been meant to transcend physical reality, but the harvester had been trapping them in cycles of destruction and rebuilding. Humanity had broken that cycle not through superior technology, but through their stubborn adherence to universal physical principles. In the aftermath, the galaxy found itself with new protectors. Earth established monitoring stations throughout known space, their primitive sensors watching for signs of similar threats. The other species, freed from the fear of advancement, began developing technology in new ways, combining their quantum capabilities with human electromagnetic principles to create truly balanced civilizations. Ambassador Hyun-woo Park now addressed a very different galactic council. The aliens who had once dismissed humanity as primitive now sought their guidance. Earth had become the template for sustainable advancement, powerful enough to defend the galaxy, but grounded enough to remain stable and uncorrupted by their capabilities. Dr. Min-ho Lee established the Galactic Archaeological Survey, using human methodology to investigate other ancient threats. The universe was vast and old, and the harvester might not have been unique. Humanity's gift for finding patterns in chaos and solving problems with simple tools had become the galaxy's most valuable resource. The final irony wasn't lost on anyone. Earth, considered the weakest civilization in the galaxy, had saved everyone by refusing to abandon their weaknesses. Sometimes the greatest strength comes not from transcending your limitations, but from understanding why those limitations exist, and working within them to achieve something greater than pure advancement could ever provide.